My dear friends, Rabbi Cantor, Steve Texon from the Cuban Hebrew congregation, greeting you Erev Pesach, the eve of the great festival of freedom of Pesach, and on the eve of Shabbat haGadol, the great Shabbat, the Shabbat preceding the festival of Passover. This year, Shabbat haGadol flows immediately into Pesach, the first Seder night. Immediate transition. As I mentioned in our model Seder that I recorded earlier this week for our congregation and community. I hope you enjoy it. Yes, immediate transition from Kodesh LeKodesh, from the holiness of Shabbat to the holiness of Yom Tov. And we don't make a Shechiyanu. We have a Havdalah. And we go from one holiness into the other. This Shabbat haGadol, which I'm going to speak about, which is this Shabbat, is great, and it's called great, even though every Shabbat is great. But the Shabbat preceding Passover, usually the rabbi gives the longest, or one of the two longest, sermons of the year. The longest being either Rosh Hashanah or Kol Nidre, and then this Shabbat haGadol. Why is this such a long sermon in days gone by? Many people think because the rabbi had to outline all the detailed laws of Passover, keeping kosher lePesach. Yes, he highlights those, he or she highlights those, but it's more than that. It's to impress upon the community that we must all get along and cooperate and attend the Seder and put our differences aside. Put aside the crumbs of chametz that impede us and make us lose sight of the bigger picture of nationhood and love and togetherness and unity. We search for chametz, these breadcrumbs, and clean out our houses. We have to clean out our hearts and minds from pettiness, from those crumbs that obstruct our thinking and that are obstacles in our lives and prevent us from relating lovingly and properly. So the Shabbat haGadol sermon is long, is great, although today we try to keep it down to a normal size. This is what makes it so great. There are many other reasons that make it great. It is great because of the great miracle back in Egypt, that on the 10th of Nisan, the Jewish people, even in slavery, sacrificed a lamb, which was a god to the Egyptians. That year, it fell on a Shabbat, 4 days before the first Seder night, the 14th of Nisan. And the Egyptians were powerless to stop us, to prevent us from the Korban Pesach. This was a great miracle. The power of our people. God intervened even to allow us to make the first Paschal lamb sacrifice. Also in the Haftorah, the prophet talks about Yom haGadol v'Hanorah, the Messianic era, where we will be redeemed again in the month of Nisan, which will usher in the Messianic era as we were redeemed in the month of Nisan in the land of Egypt thousands of years ago. Our Torah portion is Tzav, the second portion in the book of Leviticus, which is the handbook of sacrifices. There's a whole discussion about whether God really wanted those sacrifices, or whether those sacrifices of animals in particular were really a repudiation of pagan worship, of the gods of pagan worship. The cow was a god, the lamb was a god, and by sacrificing them, we show that we repudiate them, we reject animal sacrifices. Yet, other rabbis and sages, there's a big discussion between the Rambam and between Maimonides and Nachmanides. Rambam believes in the relevance and the importance of the sacrifices, then the Nachmanides says no, it's a repudiation. But that's a whole other discussion. Even today, in our conservative and reform liturgy, we eliminate Ve'ishei Yisrael, the burnt offerings. We don't want to emphasize these animal burnt sacrifices. It's disturbing in the modern era. But there were other sacrifices. There were meal offerings, for example. So, Tzav coincides this year with Shabbat haGadol. It is the second of 3 preliminary portions in Vayikra dealing with sacrifices. Vayikra, Tzav, and then following Passover we have Shemini, the ordination, the final ordination of the priests and of the of the Mishkan, the sanctuary in the desert. Interesting that Vayikra talks about the call of God for the sacrifices. Tzav is the command, tzivui, the imperative. We cannot be commanded before we are called. And God calls us, as he called Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, he, capital H, reaching out to us, that the sacrifices, the offerings will be from the heart. More important than the sacrifice itself is the willingness, the desire, the ratzon to offer, to connect with God. Korban from the word karov, draw close to God. God reaches out to us, we reach out to God in the sacrifice, and we are elevated in the act. And the ratzon of the heart, the will, is much more important to the Almighty than the actual sacrifice. So, let us heed the call and then obey the command and overcome all the pettiness, the chametz, representing arrogance, pride, ego, and submit to God's will and demonstrate, most of all, our gratitude for our deliverance in the month of Nisan. An enslaved people, freed by the greatest empire in the world, the Egyptian Empire. And we outlasted all the succeeding empires, as we will continue as an eternal people, the children of an eternal God, forever. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Kasher V'Sameach. I send love from my home to yours, my wife Nancy and son Raphael. Blessings, Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.